Thanks, everyone. I'm really excited to be here on this inaugural TCU book launch. I'm really excited to have the authors of this awesome book called Compassionomics, the revolutionary scientific evidence that caring makes a difference. I'm going to introduce them. Before I do, let me just tell you how this is going to work. So since they're zooming in, I'm able to see them. You will be able to see them when they start speaking on the big screen. They will not be able to see you or hear your questions. So what we ask is that you have any burning questions you want to ask, because there'll be many. You can write them on the cards in the middle of the paper. If we could start the clock, so then I'll be able to keep track of the time. About 20 to 7, our team is going to go around and pick up these questions, and I'll ask them at the end of our interview. Does that sound good? Okay. So let me introduce our authors. First of all, Dr. Steve, I'm going to ask you, because I've probably been pronouncing your last name wrong all along. Is it Treziak or Treziak?
It's Treziak.
Oh, I was right. Why did I even question myself? Okay. So I just want to mention that this book has been featured on shows like CNN, NPR, The Washington Post, and if those of you have read it already understand the impact of this, but throughout this interview today, you'll hear the reasons why this is getting so much interest. First, let me introduce Dr. Treziak. He's a physician scientist, chief of medicine at Cooper University Healthcare, and professor and chair of medicine at Cooper Medical School of Rowan University in Camden, New Jersey. That's where you hear my New York accent. Jersey. Okay. Dr. Treziak is a practicing intensivist and a National Institutes of Health funded clinical researcher with more than 100 publications in the scientific literature, primarily in the field of resuscitation science. Dr. Treziak's publications have been featured in prominent medical journals such as Journal of the American Medical Association, Circulation, and the New England Journal of Medicine. Currently, Dr. Treziak's research is focused on a new field called Compassionomics, which we'll talk about today, in which he is studying the scientific effects of compassion on patients, patient care, and those who care for patients. For his work, Dr. Treziak was awarded the 2019 Influencers of Healthcare Award by the Philadelphia Inquirer. Broadly, Dr. Treziak's mission is to make healthcare more compassionate through science. Dr. Treziak is a graduate of the University of Notre Dame. He earned his medical degree at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and his Master's of Public Health at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I also want to welcome Dr. Anthony Mazzarelli, his co-author, AKA, I just learned he's called Maz, so we may call you that throughout. He's an emergency medicine doc and co-president and CEO of Cooper University Healthcare in Camden, New Jersey, along with Dr. Treziak. He is also Dean of Clinical Affairs for Cooper Medical School of Rowan University. Dr. Mazzarelli received his medical degree from Robert Wood Johnson Medical School, and in his spare time, he earned a law degree from the University of Pennsylvania Law School and his master's in bioethics from the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. In 2010, he was awarded the HALO Award for leading a team of 18 healthcare providers from Cooper into Haiti in the days immediately following the 2010 earthquake. In 2012, Dr. Mazzarelli was named one of the 50 most powerful people in New Jersey healthcare by New Jersey Biz. Dr. Mazzarelli has also received numerous commendations for his leadership. Can we give him a very warm Texas, both of them a very warm Texas welcome. And they are very warm here in Texas.
It is great to be here with you. We want to say something off the bat. So this is, we're talking to you from Camden. So this is a brand new sort of mini studio area. This is Camden in the background. This is a green screen, but we couldn't put anything up here. We almost put this up here. So if you can't tell what this is, maybe you'll recognize it if we.
Now you have to do the horned frog sign. We taught them this.
Listen all day. We were literally nervous about this.
The pressure's on.
Here we go. And the ties, of course, too. So.
Absolutely. we want to thank you for the
You
honor.
look very handsome, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We want to thank you for the honor of being here with you in this book club forum, but also just for the honor that you picked our book to share with everybody. So it means a lot to us, and we're really looking forward to the conversation.
Well, let me just start by saying how I even came across this book. When I would say a little over a year ago, Val, our artistic director, Len Skeffler, discovered this book called Compassionomics. And our team read it, and we were blown away because we finally had validation for what we had been trying to do for over a decade. So while we were at the Alan Alda Center, I would say we spent half a decade trying to convince thousands of STEM scientists and mostly health professionals why this even matters, that there even is an issue or a problem. And in the second half of that decade, we honed in on developing skills of our learners in how to communicate with compassion. And on our list was to validate with research why we're doing what we're doing. And when this book came out, we were able to check that box off and move ahead on training health professionals to communicate with compassion. And yes, there now is evidence, and we'll get into that. And now we use this as a landing, as a foundation, the statistics in this book and the lessons from this book to launch our curriculum at the medical school called the Compassionate Practice. And it's different than at other medical schools. The curriculum is embedded throughout medical classes, throughout the basic science and clinical skills classes. That's an unusual way of teaching it in the medical school. And compassion is at the center of this, and we'll get into this a little more as we chat. But what really fascinated me most about this is how does an emergency medicine doc, an intensive care doc who you don't really think of them as often the most compassionate physicians in the bunch. Can you tell us how the two of you got interested in compassion?
Sure. So I'll start. And really, for me, it was an unexpected question from a 12-year-old that turned everything upside down and literally changed the direction, the trajectory of my life's work. So I was doing resuscitation science, and then the unexpected question from a 12-year-old was a question from my son. And it was a project that I was helping him with for school. He had to give a talk for his class. And the question to which he was supposed to speak is this: what is the most pressing problem of our time? Now, I don't know what you were doing in 7th grade. That's not what I was doing, but it really set me off on a period of introspection where I had to, he actually through the process challenged me to think about what is the most pressing problem of our time through my lens of experience as a physician scientist. And the overwhelming evidence that I became convicted of through a long, almost a 2-year process, journey through the data, is that we're in the midst of a compassion crisis, literally a crisis. And I became convicted of that and believed that it was really the most pressing problem of our time facing all healthcare providers. And you can either believe one of two things: either that compassion crisis matters or it does not. And so that began a 2-year journey through the data to find out what are actually the effects of compassion. And our hypothesis was that it matters, not just in meaningful ways, but also measurable ways.
So for me, well, first I'll say this, and I know Steve and I both say this often, we make no claim that we are more compassionate than other physicians. We're both works in progress, and I'd like to think after the journey of looking at all this data, I'm a little more compassionate, but I'm still working on it every day, every shift that I see patients, and we're both on that journey. But
the good news is that science shows that we actually can get better. And that's
right.
Actually a big emphasis of the book. The overwhelming evidence is that if one believes they can get better, they will.
Yeah, and so we're still both working on that. For me, around the same time that Steve had this epiphany about wanting to work on the most pressing problem of our time, I came into a new position here at Cooper University Healthcare, where I became our chief medical officer. And I was charged right away from my boss, the CEO, to improve patient experience scores and physician engagement. And she said, don't worry, I know that's a tall order, but we hired an outside consultant that will help you. And that outside consultant gave me a list of things to tell our, at the time, almost 500 physicians, now we're over 700, what those physicians should do. And I looked at that list and I thought to myself, our physicians are never going to do that. It's a list of what I thought were sort of soft, mushy things. I thought, how am I going to get them to do these things? They all seem like the right thing to do, but how am I going to get them to do these things? And we were a brand new medical school at the time. We're early in our journey, just like you. And I thought it was around 2014 or so. I'm not going to get them to do it. So I knew I needed to find some champions. I knew that it was a practice that would listen to evidence-based medicine. So I turned to our #1 NIH researcher, who was Dr. Treziak, and I said, Steve, what do you think about being our champion for this particular issue of physician engagement and patient experience? And he said, you're crazy. I'm the research guy. And I said, just see if there's any data out there. I need you to science this up. And it turns out it piqued his interest pretty quick, and he'd already kind of had this on his mind, and those two things kind of converged at the same time.
So I was asked today, why does it need to be scienced up? I mean, isn't it obvious that compassion is essential and important?
So I told you that there's evidence that there's a compassion crisis right now. So then the big question, to your point, would be, does compassion really matter? Now, of course, you'll say compassion matters in a moral and ethical sense. We have a moral imperative to treat patients with compassion. And I don't know anyone who would argue with that. But does compassion just matter in the sense of the art of medicine? Or are there also evidence-based effects belonging in the science of medicine? And what are the effects? So that's what we did in our 2-year journey through the data. The reason why we wanted to be rigorous about it and go through the data is because there are actually many people that believe that compassion is just a nice to have. Meaning, as long as you have proficient, technically excellent care, if you have compassion, it's like icing on the cake, but it's really not part of the therapy itself. The overwhelming evidence in the literature actually says otherwise. It shows that there is science in the art of medicine, and the science is strong. And we don't aim with this book to try to change anybody's hearts about compassion. Rather, we'd rather change your mind by showing you the evidence to convince people that this is really evidence-based medicine. And so it should be considered as essential as all the things that we consider to be the technical parts of quality care.
I liken it to when people think of compassion now as medicine gets more complex, it gets harder to practice. I think patients feel that as much as those that provide care. People think of it now like a good meal, like, okay, the medicine is eating your entree. And then if there's time, if I have room in my belly, I'll have some dessert, and that's the compassion you sprinkle on top. But what we found in the evidence, and it's not our opinion, it's what we found. And what we found in the evidence is it needs to be part of the meal. It needs to be part of the evidence-based practice that we have.
Before we get too far along, in our travels, we have heard many different definitions for empathy and compassion. Can you define for us what you mean by compassion?
Sure we can. Now, there is some difference of opinion in some areas of the scientific community, but most researchers define compassion this way. Compassion is the emotional response to another's pain or suffering involving the authentic desire to help. So it's different from a closely related term, empathy, which is the detecting and feeling and understanding component, and that compassion also involves taking action. So the responsive action is what differentiates compassion from empathy. And of course, empathy is absolutely vital, because if you don't detect, feel, and understand another's pain or suffering, you'll miss it entirely. You'll never be motivated to take action with compassion, and it'll be an opportunity lost. We like to say empathy plus action equals compassion. And similarly, if you could have empathy through a one-way mirror, but you can't have compassion. So compassion is really the responsive action, and empathy is vital, or compassion will never happen in the first place.
Yeah. And as the champ was talking about before we started, about the neuroscience, right? The neuroscience of reading. There's neuroscience behind the differences between empathy and compassion. So empathy lights up the negative parts of emotion in your brain, but compassion lights up the positive emotions and positive pathways and reward in the brain. So we also say empathy hurts, but compassion heals.
I like that. So we teach, empathy plus action equals compassion. So you said you have to have the mindset, you have to want to be compassionate. But the question we get a lot, and I'm wondering if you have as well, can it be taught?
I actually did not believe, when we started this journey, I personally did not believe that compassion is something that you could learn. I thought you were either wired for compassion or you're not, like something that's in your DNA and the fabric of who you are. But when you look at the biomedical literature and actually the scientific literature at large, and even in psychology studies, so this is inside of healthcare as well as outside of healthcare, the preponderance of evidence in the scientific literature shows quite clearly that, in fact, empathy and compassion can be learned. And we're talking about behaviors. We're not talking about what someone believes in their mind, but how do you behave towards another person, which is ultimately what they're going to be experiencing.
So how are you tackling this problem at your medical school?
So the first thing I want to mention is that if you believe that you can't learn to be compassionate, or you can't learn empathy for that matter, you won't. So there's something called mindset. So there was a book named Mindset by Carol Dweck, who's a Stanford psychology researcher. And what she found, mostly in the domain of education, but also in the domain of compassion, is that if people have a growth mindset about compassion, and growth mindset meaning it's a skill, not a trait. If you believe it's a skill, then you believe that you can in fact get better. You're going to try harder. If you believe it's a trait and it's not in your DNA or in the fabric of who you are, you won't. So first of all, the learners must believe that they can in fact get better, or they won't.
And I think you're at an advantage because you're one of the newer schools. We're one of the newer schools. So we're building this curriculum from the ground up. So we can infuse it into the curriculum as it being evidence-based, as it being part of the curriculum. Whereas I think some of the other medical schools, they're kind of bolting it on a little bit later. I think it exists in medical schools now, the pieces, but it hasn't yet moved from the nice to have or the art part into the science part. It's not held with the same weight. And that's the part that needs to happen. And so here we're showing that those weights should be equal, and we're talking about it a lot. And that's the first step to infusing it. So there needs to be training, and there needs to be what those behaviors are, but just holding the mindset that those things need to be equally weighted and belongs in the realm of evidence medicine is important. So what you're doing and infusing into your curriculum, not something that's feeling shoveled in to a 100-year-old curriculum, that's important. And so it's important that both organizations are doing that.
Yeah. We published on it. So our group published a paper in PLOS ONE, which is Public Library of Science, one of the Public Library of Science journals. We published a systematic review of all of the compassion training programs for physicians that have ever been published. We were first of all surprised to find that there have been 53. And what we found is that although the training programs themselves for healthcare providers, specifically in this case physicians, were somewhat heterogeneous, 75% of the studies found that the training program did in fact move the needle in some measurable, demonstrable way for compassion for the healthcare providers. So in essence, the paper we just recently published, actually it came out since Compassionomics was published as a book, but we found that compassion training, at least for physicians, it works.
And you probably have noticed that you can train the medical students, but now you need to think about those that train the medical students. So getting the faculty to change, getting the practicing physicians to change is very hard in medicine. So there's always a pushback. We talk in the book about how around the change of turn of the century between the 1700s and the 1800s, there was a huge divide in the world of critical care medicine, intensive care medicine that Steve practices, about what to do when a patient stops breathing. And half of the world believed that you should blow air in people's lungs. And the other half of the world believed you should blow smoke through a tobacco enema up their behind. And that was the divide in the world. And it was a huge battle. And the greatest minds had giant debates about this. And it took years for people to ultimately decide. And I know this audience are not trained clinicians, so the answer, just so everyone knows, is to blow air in the lungs. That's where the expression blow smoke, right, comes from. But it takes time to change people's minds. So it starts by doing it in medical school, which we're doing, but it takes a lot of time to change things. So we think it starts by having the right evidence, and that's part of the reason why we really wanted to write the book.
Can I add? I'd just like to add one thing onto that. We should have said this at the beginning. We usually do.
Oh yeah, the disclaimer.
We want to assure you that we don't have any kind of magical thinking about compassion. Okay, so the primary determinant of clinical outcome is clinical excellence. The primary determinant of clinical outcome is clinical excellence. So if you're a surgeon and you botch a surgery, or if you're a physician who prescribes the wrong medication, there's no amount of compassion that's going to undo that. So it's clinical excellence plus compassion yields the best outcomes. Emma Seppala is a scientist from Stanford who also is a contributor for the Washington Post. And when our book just came out last summer, she wrote an article in the Post in which the social media tagline that they associated with it was, would you rather have a physician who is compassionate or graduated at the top of the class in medical school? As if it's an either or. So we urge you not to take the bait on that line of thinking, because it's not an either or, it's an and. You can actually be compassionate and very good technically.
Yeah, so Judy lives this and breathes this. You know, if we say we're training our students to communicate with compassion, the next question is, well, oftentimes is, well, are they going to be good doctors? Are they going to know medicine? And we're, the same thing that we're hearing as well. It's very interesting.
When you ask patients what they want, they often, and this has been studied repeatedly in numerous survey studies published both in the lay press as well as in medical literature, when you ask patients what they want, they more often than not name the caring parts of healthcare. And it might be because, not that they don't want proficient care, technically sound care, excellent care, of course they do, but they're more likely than not to give physicians or other healthcare providers the benefit of the doubt and thinking everybody's proficient. When you ask them what they want, they name the caring parts of healthcare. In fact, a recent survey study found that 85% of patients were willing to drive farther and pay more for compassionate care. A Wall Street Journal study found that caring parts of healthcare is what patients want when you actually ask them. And there are numerous studies which show that compassion communicates competence. So when patients visit physicians and they're not treated with compassion, they're more likely to doubt all the aspects of that physician's care, including the technical aspects.
So there are many great findings and statistics in your book. Can you summarize the ones for our audience who have and maybe have not read the book? What are the most significant findings to you? What surprised you the most?
Yes, sir. So we looked at 1,000 abstracts and over 280 articles. So I'm going to let Steve give you the total summary of all that. Go.
And you only have 15 seconds.
Yep.
Well, we can't summarize 280 original science research papers here, but what I can tell you is that we found evidence that compassion makes measurable, not just meaningful, but measurable differences for patients. And I'll talk about some broad categories of that real quick. Physiological effects, psychological effects, patient self-care, so helping patients want to take better care of themselves, as well as associated with better quality of care. In addition, there's also evidence for benefits for patient care, so improving the quality of care, reducing medical errors, and reducing the cost of care. And then for our healthcare providers as well. So there's evidence that compassion is beneficial, not just for the receiver of compassion, but for the giver too. And there's an epidemic right now of burnout in healthcare workers, which is come over into the lay press, and you've probably seen some headlines on that. There's evidence that actually connecting with patients in a meaningful way, in a compassionate way, and the trust and the relationship that builds is fulfilling for the healthcare providers. That actually is the fulfilling part of healthcare, builds resilience and resistance to burnout. And in some cases, after burnout set in, can actually be an antidote to burnout.
It's interesting you asked about being surprised, because a lot of this data surprised me. And I can give you a couple specific examples. But when we talk to different audiences, it doesn't seem to ever surprise people who are not in medicine. It doesn't seem to surprise nurses. It surprises physicians, like it surprised us a little bit. But most people go, duh, particularly nurses, like we've known this forever. In fact, we actually have had
nurses actually invented compassionate healthcare.
That's true.
Right? So.
It's true. I mean, our sharpest critics, even actually, if you look this up, are nurses that wrote, did it take a couple doctors to write what nursing is known for centuries? And
they're always ahead of the game, nurses.
In fact, there's actual data that shows that nurses are better at telling which physicians are compassionate than the physicians themselves are good at telling whether they're compassionate.
So tell us the reaction you're getting from colleagues. Are they slapping you on the back, good job, or, oh my God, what are you doing to us? Or somewhere in between?
Mostly, I think it's mostly been positive for us. I think early on, I mean, we went around and we've been talking about this before we wrote the book. So we had a lot of the early reactions, or people who kind of pushed back. We were able to do that before the book came out. I mean, we're doing this in an evidence-based fashion, and we have our colleagues are fantastic evidence-based faculty at a new medical school. So they reacted exactly as we wanted people to react. That's what inspired us to do the extra step and write the book. So it's mostly been a positive reaction, at least from our colleagues around here. And so we've been very, very thrilled at that.
Yes, I mentioned burnout earlier. So one of the key components of burnout is depersonalization. So an inability to make a personal connection. We talk to physicians all the time. They just want to get that back. There's compelling evidence in the literature that healthcare providers now spend more time looking into computer screens than looking patients in the eyes. We believe that has had well, first of all, electronic health records save lives. There's no doubt about that. But there are unintended consequences. And one of the unintended consequences is that it's taken something away from the human connection part of healthcare. So the feedback that we get from our colleagues is they just want to be doctors again and not be typing into the keyboard. And so they've been very supportive of the work because it underscores that we need to get the human connection part back to healthcare. It's definitely what patients want, but we can tell you it's what doctors want too.
So in your book, you also focus on the cost in medicine, and the questions that we often get is it takes more time, it's going to cost more money. Can you summarize your findings on that?
So I'll talk about costs, and I'll let Steve talk about time. So we have a whole chapter in the book that talks about costs, and that it turns out that compassion can both increase the revenue side to help you make more money, and then can do a lot to decrease on the cost side, so on the spending side. So, and there's a lot of different mechanisms of how that can happen. So from decreasing costs, it turns out that when providers, particularly physicians, have a patient-centered practice, primary care physicians, the data shows they order less tests, they refer to specialists less, their patients end up in the hospital less, the total charges for their patients at the end of the year are less. So you actually end up having less costs for those patients. You look at other things, like there's over almost $300 billion a year that's spent on medical care due to non-adherence to medications, people who don't take their medications. And some of the most numerous studies out there on compassion are that when you have a caregiver that's compassionate, people are more compliant with their medications. So those are just a couple of the things. And then you can go through turnover that has to do from burnout, malpractice, almost every area where they looked at compassion, it can actually lower costs. When you look at medical errors and the effect of medical errors, that number gets big real quickly when you look at how many people. I mean, there's a couple articles, the Institute of Medicine said years ago in 1998 that about 98,000 people die from preventable medical errors every year. Then Johns Hopkins a few years ago said it's actually the third leading cause of death, and maybe it's 250,000 people every year. Well, if you take that and think about the loss of productivity and the people that die every year and the impact they have, it can get close to $1 billion a year. So if you can start to say that compassion can decrease those medical errors and some of those other things I talked about, it can do a significant amount to lower costs, because the healthcare costs are unbelievable. It's if you think of what we spend in this country on healthcare right now, $3.5 billion. In 2018, the last year they had it for the GDP. It's the 5th largest economy in the world. We spend in this country on hip and knee replacements what the entire box office is in the movie industry. So you're talking about a huge amount of money. So if you can do something that can chip away at those costs, it can be significant dollars.
I just want to remind the audience that about 10 minutes, our team's going to be coming around to pick up questions. If you have any, just write them on the cards in the middle of the table. So these facts and these statistics are very compelling. Are you seeing any changes in the works, even thoughts, ideas in your healthcare system and other healthcare systems in making these changes? And what changes do you even recommend?
So I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, and that's time. And so this also dovetails with the concept of mindset. So a few years back, a group of Harvard investigators published in the Journal of General Internal Medicine some results that I find completely striking. And the number was 56. That was the percentage of physicians in this study who answered that they don't have time for compassion. They don't have time for compassion. It begs a question, how much time does it actually take? So we devote a whole chapter on this in Compassionomics to the issue of time. And what we have found through, there are 5 different studies that have been published in the biomedical literature. All of them found that when you precisely measure it, it actually takes less than 60 seconds to make a meaningful connection with compassion. Less than 60 seconds. Now, why is it that we always think we don't have enough time to be compassionate? There are many sentinel studies, classical studies from the psychology domain showing that when we feel like we're in a hurry, we're less likely to stop and offer help to someone. That's even if you're not actually in a hurry, you just think you are. Again, this is just mindset. And when we know it takes less than 60 seconds, it becomes, in my mind, the idea that we can either go through our day with brusque efficiency, letting everybody know just how busy we are, or we can treat everybody with compassion. And if somebody was next to us with a stopwatch, you would actually find that in reality, it doesn't take any more time. Just for some reason, we believe it does. And it reminds me of a University of Pennsylvania study on the topic of time affluency, which is the term that they assign to the idea that we have plenty of time, we're not in a hurry at all. And they did randomized trials in 4 different experiments to see what uses of time would make people feel differently about their time. It was either spending time on yourself, wasting time, having an unexpected windfall of free time, or spending time on others. and there was only one use of time that actually increased people's sense of time affluency, and that was spending time on others. When you spend time on others, it makes you feel different about the time that you have. It makes you actually feel like you have more time. So giving time gives you time. This is an issue of mindset. Compassion actually doesn't take, some people would argue it doesn't take any more time at all, forget 60 seconds. And that in my mind is what I'm seeing in the people around me, because we're trying to adopt the mindset that compassion really doesn't take any more time.
So you have drank your Kool-Aid just like we have. We believe compassion is important and can be taught. How have you changed your day-to-day practice, your relationships with other people based on your findings? Some things you can suggest to other people to change their ways.
Well, for me, and I tell the story of this in the book, I went through burnout myself. So after nearly 20 years of working in an ICU, and when you work in an ICU, you meet people and their families on the worst day of their life. So after about 20 years of that, I found myself in the throes of burnout. And I assure you that that is not a good place to be. And I was newly, had Maz and I curated all this evidence that compassion can be a beneficial therapy for the giver too. And I wasn't buying into the notion of what we call escapism. Some people like to think that the antidote to burnout is escapism, just get away. So as if go on vacation, detach, go do more yoga, go on nature hikes, as if getting away from patients as much as possible would make everything okay. And I just wasn't buying that. And knowing that there's more evidence that compassion can be a beneficial therapy for the giver too, I just decided to flip it completely around. And rather than pulling back and detaching, I was going to connect more, care more, spend more time talking to my patients and families, spending more time connecting with my colleagues, because it's relationships that build resilience and resistance to burnout. So more time with colleagues, connecting at home, connecting in general. And that was when the fog of burnout began to lift for me. So what I've done is realize through a very powerful, I would say life-changing N of one experiment, that compassion matters. And I just try to do it every day because it's just been powerful for me.
How about you, Maz?
Well, for me, it's interesting because in the emergency department, I still see patients, but I don't practice as much. So I'm bulletproof from things really bothering me while I'm seeing patients, because I'm just so happy to be there because I love doing it. So, but this has changed me a lot for the way I approach how I do think about things administratively, because when I think of the world paying us more on value and on outcomes, when I think about how there's more and more burnout, so I have to worry about the turnover of physicians. When you think about how costs are rising for us in healthcare and revenue is decreasing, well, the lowest cost solution to all of those things is this idea of how we treat each other and is there human connection. And there are chapters that were on the cutting room floor because the book was getting too long. This doesn't just apply how we treat patients, it's how we treat each other and how we treat our staff and how we treat our colleagues. There's even a study about how CMOs and senior executives treat each other. So to me, this is a low cost intervention in order to get all these outcomes we want and create a culture where I can keep people engaged in what they do. There's a story we talk about in the book about it happened in our ICU, where our ICU nurses, one night there was a patient and he had a bleed in his brain. And it was pretty obvious that he was not going to live through the night. And his daughter was there and she was going to get married in a few weeks. And her wish was to get married before her father passed away. And they were up against the clock. And so the nurses in the ICU actually held an impromptu wedding. They made a ring out of IV tubing. They got flowers from someone that donated flowers in a nearby room. A family donated it. They got a pound cake from the back of the staff refrigerator. They found something blue. They found a staff member who's an ordained minister. and they held an impromptu wedding right there in the ICU, right before her father passed. You can imagine that those ICU nurses are so engaged in their job because they did that the chances of those nurses leaving and finding somewhere else to work because they think the grass is greener is so low that they're going to be engaged in what they do because of the way they treated each other and the way they treated that patient. So I think this becomes a tool to use on how we treat each other, not just the patients.
So we're hearing how it makes you feel, how it has changed you. Are you seeing that from the patients? From the last hospital I was at, the biggest complaint upon discharge was the doctor didn't let me finish telling my story. Have you seen any change in your hospital since you've published this book?
So our this last year, we just got our data, is our highest employee engagement scores we've ever had, and our highest patient engagement scores we've ever had, our highest physician communication scores we've ever had. Is it a coincidence? Maybe. I don't know. I think it's one piece of it. I think it would be wrong to say that Compassionomics is the reason for all of that. I think it's one piece of us trying to move to a culture that doesn't actually focus on those numbers, but focuses on the things that we do and how we treat each other and how we treat our patients. So I think that's maybe a piece of evidence. I know that when we asked our nurses to do a word cloud of the one word to describe nursing care at Cooper, the word that popped and was the number one was compassion, but I think you'd find that in a lot of places. So I think that the jury is still out, but it's something that we're talking about more and more.
Yeah. So the rate limiting step that you focused on was fixed mindset. So is it fair to say that just the awareness of that there is a problem and we can teach this has moved the dial a little without even implementing a rigorous program?
I think it's three things. I think it's mindset that there is a problem and that the solution is evidence-based. I often talk to our staff when I'm rounding, and they are very, very proud that they practice evidence-based medicine. They would never want to give the antibiotic that doesn't fix that particular disease. So why would they not want to do the particular intervention that fixes and improves outcomes? And that kind of explanation, when we can give data behind it, is very enticing, I think, to all caregivers. We just have that data at our fingertips because this is a place where we curated and put all that data together.
Can you talk to this new burgeoning field now? Is it called Compassionomics? What does it look like, and where are we headed?
So we use the term Compassionomics because we consider it to be the convergence of the science and the art of medicine. We don't know what the field, if we can call it that, will look like 5, 10, 15 years from now. But we think that it's time to stop thinking of compassion in just sentimental and emotional ways and to start thinking of compassion in scientific ways, because there's already abundant evidence that the signal became clear as we started pulling it all together from actually many decades of research. But we believe that voices in medicine, important voices, well-meaning voices in medicine, have been calling for more compassion in healthcare for decades. And if we're being honest, we're not seeing that move the needle at all. In fact, there's evidence to the contrary that it's slipping backwards. So that's why Maz and I wrote Compassionomics, because it's time for a new approach if the old approach that we keep trying over and over again is not working. And so that's why we want to think about it in scientific ways rather than just sentimental, emotional, moral, and ethical ways.
And economics is the study of the economy. Genomics is the study of genes. So that's why we think of Compassionomics as the study of compassion.
So now we have that evidence that this matters. We believe it can be taught. How can we all work together as educators to help move that dial? You know, we've been blessed to be in a medical school that it's at the heart of their mission, and you now have that as well at a brand new medical school. How can we help other medical schools and hospitals build upon this and move that dial?
Sounds like TCU and UNTHSC wants to be a research collaborator with our Center for Humanism at CMSRU. Great. We look
Yes. Count us in.
Excellent.
That's how, though, right? It needs to be just like if it was interest in studying sepsis, like Steve used to do, or resuscitation research. It's a branch of science that we need to continue to have the research, publish on it, and keep the awareness out there.
And we need to be as rigorous in the approach as Matt said, as with everything else, because if compassion mattered all the time, 100% full throttle, then there'd be no point in studying it. If it never mattered, there'd be no point in studying it either, right? We know that there's got to be, sometimes it matters more than others. We want to define what a responder looks like and find out in what cases patients will respond more than in others. And that's why we think it's a wide open field for further research. But the rigor of the approach has to be there, or otherwise it's not going to be as compelling as we need it to be.
And what we haven't mentioned with research in this area with evidence, that also brings money. You know, one of the, I never got questions when I was at the Alda Center and teaching the skills. Does this matter? Is there really a lack of compassion? There was never that question. The only time I ever got that question was when somebody had to open up their checkbook and write, or for a grant purpose, they wanted to see the evidence. Are you seeing any changes? You know, there's not a lot of money in grants right now for this kind of research. Are you hoping or seeing that this is going to change that?
So we're writing grants right now. We have one under review at the NIH. We are writing another one as we speak. And our approach is that as long as we're let me just read between the lines what I think you were saying. Some people may say that this is soft science. It's only soft science if your approach is soft. And so we've developed, so just for example, just this year, in addition to the systematic review that we published a paper in JAMA Network Open, which is JAMA's new open access journal, about a measurement tool in which we can precisely measure compassion of the caregiver from the patient perspective. This is validated in more than 6,000 patients and is as psychometrically strong as any other question that's asked of patients in any other on any other platform. And we're testing hypotheses right now. For example, in our research program, I'll just give one example. We're testing the association between compassion of the caregivers during a life-threatening medical emergency and the outcome of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. So imagine laying on the gurney in the emergency department in the throes of a life-threatening medical emergency with people scrambling all around you, and you can tell that your life is hanging in the balance. You may even hear them saying things like, we're losing her, or he's circling the drain, or things like this that just terrify you beyond anything possibly could. Imagine how vulnerable you are in that moment. Well, what we've shown in a pilot study that we published this year in intensive care medicine is that compassion from a caregiver at that point, when you're the most vulnerable, lowers the risk of developing PTSD symptoms at 30 days, which actually occurs in almost 1/3 of patients who go through that experience.
And the compassion intervention in that study was performed by a medical student from a medical school who ended up being the first author on our paper.
Wow. Great. So if it's okay with you, we're going to spend the last 10 minutes answering some of our audience questions.
Great.
The first question is, how do we keep all the learned behavior of compassion ingrained in individuals despite the stress of caregiving?
So the evidence in the biomedical literature shows that compassionate behaviors can be learned. What we don't know, and so this is what I would consider to be a knowledge gap at the present time, is if those behaviors are sustained long-term versus having to repeat the training over and over again. It really gets at the question, like, what's the dose of compassion training? Do you need to be inoculated every 3 months or get a refresher or a booster shot? Or is it something, it's a one and done? It's probably not, right? It's probably something that you need to keep engaged with and continuing to study, just like Maz and I, every 10 years, we need to take our boards in our board certifications. Similarly, we probably need to be lifelong learners in how to take better care of people.
It's also an interesting question because I very rarely would you get the question, how do physicians remember how to take the best care of patients when they're stressed? How does the medicine not sort of fall out of their head, right? Well, why are you not concerned about that, but you're concerned about remembering to be compassionate, right? If you build the muscle memory to always say thank you, if you build the muscle memory to make that initial connection and introduction, the muscle memory to sit down or look people in the eye, whatever these behaviors are, you're more likely to have them be something that you do. We talk in the book about acting, the difference between surface acting and deep acting. You can act and still have that impression of compassion on patients. If you're surface acting, maybe you don't get the benefit as the person who's providing the compassion, but you can do what's called deep acting, where, and people do this, parents do this all the time. You put on a happy face for your kids, even though you're actually not happy. You're still doing that from a place of love. You're doing it from a place of caring, where you still get the benefit as a parent. They still get the benefit of a child, even though that you're not actually in a good mood, right? So you can essentially, it's a form of faking it or not really. But that kind of deep acting, you still get the benefits. There's even benefits to the patient if you do the surface acting.
So that's interesting. You know, our compassionate practice curriculum, one of the pillars of it is theater acting. We often don't get a very good reaction from our colleagues to the word acting. Do you have that same response when you use that word? And how do you respond to it?
I usually get into this difference between surface acting and deep acting. If anyone who's a parent, I mean, you're acting all the time, but you're doing it from a place of love and you're getting that impact.
I would say you're not really faking it.
Yeah,
right?
So we actually have this argument. Like, when you do the deep acting, are you faking it or are you not faking? Whatever you're doing, whatever it is, it's works.
It's what I think it is it's genuine emotion. You're just being very intentional about it because you want to communicate love and security to your kid, even though you may be totally stressed out and had the worst day at work you ever had. You need to communicate a certain emotion to your kid because you love them. And we don't love patients in the same way. We care about them in different ways, but we have our head of cardiology is Phil Corin, and he often says that if I'm having a bad day when I go to see my patient in the exam room, I check that at the door because this patient has been waiting weeks, maybe months to see me, and they deserve my best. So I'm on. And it's not that he's faking it because he genuinely cares about his patients. He's just being intentional about the emotion and making that override whatever bad mood he was about to carry into the exam room. So I don't really think it's faking it. I think it's just born of intentionality.
This is kind of piggyback on the answer you just gave about, are there technological solutions to remind or prompt practitioners to engage with their patient in a personal way? So those that have not developed the muscle memory, doesn't come easy to them, empathy is a spectrum. Do you think, are there any of these technological advances and do they work?
So I'll give you a technical advance I think will work. I don't know of there's a lot of alert fatigue in medicine, in the EMR, where people kind of blow past the alerts. We're actually trying to put into place to lower the number of alerts. But there is a technology I think is going to make a big difference. Well, technology tends to be the thing that gets blamed, that is pulling providers away from patients. I think it's actually going to be the thing that brings us back. There's something called the ambient clinical integration. And there's warring companies. And when I tell you what it is in a second, I'll tell you that I think that it will dominate medicine within the next decade. I think that physicians see patients for free and they get paid to do paperwork. And I think a lot of them feel that way. And ambient clinical integration is, and a bunch of companies are warned to do this, is the idea that you go into a room, and I've seen a demonstration of this. You go into a room, you talk to a patient, there's a microphone that hangs from the ceiling, and you have your normal conversation, you do your exam, and you talk out loud about your exam, and it creates your documentation for you. It's not dictation. It doesn't just copy what you say. It actually thinks about what you say and creates the note the way that you would normally write a patient note. I believe in about 10 years, we won't ever have to worry about the biggest worry we worry about, which is all the different kinds of documentation. That would be an incredible technology that would allow us to connect with patients more. And
Take your face out of the medical record.
Yep.
And what we sometimes call eyeball time, where you're making eye contact with your patients. If you don't have that, the research shows that they're much less likely to disclose to you what is really bothering them, because sometimes our patients have the most personal things that they need to talk about, and they're less likely to do so if you're not connecting with them. And eye contact is just one of the most fundamental pieces of that. So anything that can keep our eyes focused on our patients and not on a computer screen is going to be beneficial. The other thing I will just add is there's a lot of talk now about artificial intelligence in electronic health records and in medicine in general. Rather, it's vitally important that that these technologies bring up cues like to prompt us, to remind us to order this kind of cancer screening or that kind of cancer screening. What I think might happen in the future, what I know companies are working on, is to remind clinicians of other things. Like, for example, hey, it's the 1-year anniversary of the death of his wife. Maybe you ought to ask him how he's doing today, right? So that's where artificial intelligence can actually help us be more human.
Interesting. The next question is, can you give us, I guess this is more for us, can you give a specific example of how this is being implemented at the TCU Medical School in the classroom? So I'll just briefly answer, and then I'll throw it back to you to see if you have any specific examples in your medical school. So the compassionate practice I mentioned is one of the pillars is theater. It also is journalism and narrative medicine, as well as public health. And that gives us this holistic approach of the whole patient. And a lot of communications curriculum comes from an inauthentic place when training the student. And the compassionate practice, we focus on more authentic connection. And in order to do that, you have to understand and think about who this patient is, where they're coming from, and what is their goal in that moment. And again, as a provider, who are you? Where are you coming from in that moment? And what is your goal? And that way will enable you to connect more with your patient and also deal with any of these biases that you may be coming into the room with. And that's a practice, something that can be a framework that can be practiced, honed, and then if you're giving a diagnosis of cancer to 3 women with breast cancer, you're not going to give it the same way. You're going to give it in a way that it will land with that patient. And it may take more time or less with a different patient, but you have to understand who they are and where they're coming from and what their goal is, and your goal going into that room. How about on your end? Is there anything specific?
Well, we often say that Compassionomics is a book about the why. Why is it so vital to treat patients with compassion, and why is it important for you to treat patients with compassion? So it's really the why behind it. The next question is the what. And so we have experts and our colleagues at Cooper Medical School at Rowan University, which is our medical school here. Obviously, Yvonne is an expert in these things, and they're going to be on the leading edge of the what and how to train the next generation of physicians. What I do, just very practically speaking, is I just remind my medical students, interns, and residents that work with me in the ICU at Cooper, is that patients expect compassion is the most basic thing. And going back to the idea of compassion communicates competence, I teach my students and residents that if you don't treat patients with compassion, if you don't treat the family with compassion, how do they know that you know how to do the most basic things that are clinical? How do they know that you know how to read the chest x-ray? How do they know that you know how to read the EKG? You might have graduated at the top of your class in medical school. I guarantee you they don't have your transcript. But if you treat them with compassion, more likely than not, they're going to give you the benefit of the doubt that you know exactly what you're doing.
We have only 45 seconds left, and I want to leave it in your hands. Anything you want to leave us with, anything we have, a burning point you want to get across, something that you think is important to leave this audience with?
No, it's to thank you. I mean, what you're doing is fantastic. It is very rare for us to speak to an audience that has a new medical school that is so focused on this already. So we not only appreciate the invitation tonight, but really are grateful for all that you're doing in your school and at TCU to make this part of what you're doing with your students.
It's really encouraging us to know that you're working hard on this. We know you are, Yvonne, and we know your work, and we're real thankful for what you and your colleagues are doing. And it's just, it's really inspiring just to connect and to have that synergy. We're just really grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah, we want to thank you, and we look forward to working with you to move the dial. I hope this conversation will continue on Goodreads, and I'm hoping both of you, now that you have access to Goodreads, may want to chime in every once in a while and give any answers to some questions or thoughts. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.